Okay, so we're going to start by looking at our lipids here. So we're going to be talking about the different types of fats that we have. These are water-insoluble compounds, so that's what makes them different from our other macronutrients. So they do not dissolve in water. They will also provide us 9 calories per gram. If you remember back to carbohydrates and protein, they both provide 4 calories per gram approximately. And so these lipids are much more calorically dense. They can come from plant or animal sources in our diet. We have 4 major classes that we'll look at in more detail. So we have fatty acids, triglycerides, sterols, and phospholipids. So what do these lipids do? So we do need fat. Back in the 90s, it was the trend of really low fat diets, and a lot of people had negative side effects from that because we do need fat in our diet. So they play a role in cell membrane function, help transport our fat-soluble nutrients. We have several of our vitamins that are fat-soluble. They help cushion, protect, and insulate our organs. They are a concentrated source of energy. If you remember, most of our excess energy will get stored as fat. So if we take in more calories than we need, we may store a small amount as that glycogen, but most of that will be converted into fat. And so that's how we're storing energy. Contributes to texture and flavor of food, which is also important, and it can increase our satiety or fullness, satisfaction with meals. So let's start by talking about those fatty acids. So essentially a fatty acid is a chain of carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms attached to it, and a carboxyl group at one end and a methyl group, on the other end. And that's our fatty acid. And I'll show you guys a picture of what that looks like. These fatty acids make up the primary component of triglycerides and phospholipids. There are 2 ways that we characterize our fatty acids. The first one is by chain length. So you can see here short chain, medium chain, and long chain fatty acids. You may have heard about a little bit with this. The area I really actually see this talked about the most is with like coconut oil. You hear it talked about the different types of chain length of those fatty acids. And then also degree of saturation. So saturated, unsaturated, etc. So those are 2 ways that we're going to classify our types of fatty acids. So saturated contains no double bonds, and the chain carries a maximum amount of hydrogen. So essentially it's saturated with hydrogens. We cannot put any more hydrogens into that fatty acid. These tend to be more solid at room temperature. So things like butter, some of our palm oil, coconut oil, those tropical oils, lard, those things are going to be solid at room temperature. Now again, these things will turn into a liquid state if you heat them up, but normally if they're just sitting out at about 70 degrees, they will remain a solid. Unsaturated then is going to have at least 1 double bond in there, so it doesn't have the maximum amount of hydrogens. And there are 2 major types to look at with monounsaturated, you may have heard of, which just has 1 double bond, and then polyunsaturated has 2 or more double bonds. And these tend to be more liquid at room temperature. So more things like our olive oils and other vegetable oils tend to be more of that unsaturated. Trans fats then, or trans fatty acids, is really when you, and I'll show you what this looks like, but have hydrogen atoms that are arranged on opposite sides of the double bond. So it's just a different way of arranging those hydrogens. One thing to note is that, and I'll show you this as well, but just because butter has more saturated fat doesn't mean it's 100% saturated fat. It doesn't mean our vegetable oils are 100% unsaturated fat. So they're a mixture of different types of fatty acids for our fat types. So hopefully this gives you a little bit better image when we talked about what those look like. So the first one is saturated fatty acid, and you can see there's no double bonds. All of those hydrogens are in place. We couldn't put any more hydrogen in there. If you're a chemistry person, note that each carbon has to have 4 bonds. And so that's hence why this one is maximum. We couldn't add any more hydrogens in because the carbon needs 4 bonds, not 3, not 5, but 4. So you can see what that looks like. You can then see our mono unsaturated with that 1 double bond. And so you can see how there are 2 hydrogen atoms missing. So that carbon has 4 bonds, but it's only bonded to 2 other things, and then it's bonded to those 2 carbons twice. So there's a double bond in there making those 4 bonds. So you could see you theoretically could add more hydrogen. It's not saturated with hydrogen. There's room to put that more hydrogens in there. Then you have your polyunsaturated, which again has, this one has 2, but it could have 3, which just means 2 or more of those double bonds in there as well. And so it's also showing you some of the food sources, whether it's solid or liquid at room temperature, so you can look through that a little bit. When it gets down to the last point on this page, it's showing you cis versus trans fatty acids. If you look at the top, the cis arrangement is both hydrogens are on the same side of the double bond, and when it comes to trans arrangement, the hydrogens are on opposite sides of the double bonds. Now, again, if you're not a chemistry person, that may seem insignificant to you, but what it does is change the way they can configure and really pack together, essentially. And so if you think about it, if you were going to if anyone tried to pack hangers, I feel like when you try to pack hangers in a box, it's never a good idea. They all, you can't really stack them up well because they're an odd shape, and things get tangled, and you really can't fit as many as you probably could in there. And it's kind of the same thing. Again, that's a silly description, but that gives you an idea. If you were trying to pack these triangle odd-shaped hangers or just one straight rod, you could probably much more efficiently pack the straight rod, like the trans arrangement is getting in there, into a box than you could the cis. And so making the trans fats a little bit more solid at room temperature. And so that's the classic example of our trans fats is going to be things like margarine. Now, a lot of margarines these days are not made with trans fats, but originally that's what it was. They took vegetable oil and made it into this trans fatty acid form and made it a little bit more solid, so it was more spreadable. And so you will see more trans fats in those type of foods. So hopefully this visual gives you a little bit of insight. I would come back to this when you're studying just to make sure you feel good about what's going on. So triglycerides then is going to be our major source of lipids both in our body and in our foods that we eat. So you can see it's 95% of the lipids in the foods that we eat and 99% of the stored fat we have in our body. So obviously it makes up a big component of our lipids. And what a triglyceride is a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached. And what I want to show here, which I like that they did in this image, is it shows you that these fatty acids all look different. So that's where, it's not like one food has all the same fatty acids and all the triglycerides. These are a mixture of things with that. So you can see the different types of fatty acids that may be in there. Triglycerides are going to be a major source of energy. They're going to carry fat-soluble vitamins. So again, this is our major storage form and the major food of fat that we're really eating in our foods as well. So those are key points I would make sure to know about triglycerides. This is another chart that I think is helpful to look at. Remember I was talking about how, one food, even though it has a lot of saturated fat, it's not 100% saturated or vice versa. So most of them are a combination of different fatty acids. So you can see on the top, those are foods that are higher in our polyunsaturated fatty acids, things like walnuts, sunflower oil, soybean oil, etc. But they do still have some mono and saturated fatty acids. Then the next group down is foods that are high in monounsaturated fatty acids, but you can see they also do have some saturated and polyunsaturated as well. And then same thing when it comes to your saturated fats, coconut oil, and then butter. And then the meat and some of our animal products tends to be more saturated, like beef, bacon, etc. But it's not necessarily saying that that's 100% saturated. Some of them we'll consider good sources of saturated fatty acids, but they're not even over 50% of saturated fats. So you can see how that makes up. Typically, our animal fats tend to have higher saturated fat, and our plants tend to have higher of our unsaturated fats. So hopefully that opens things up a little bit for you. So when we talk about sterols, again, cholesterol is probably the most common one that we see. You can see carbon rings. These look very different than our other types of lipids. It's really the only one that's got those ring-like structures. And these are precursors for hormone production. Again, cholesterol is a really common one that we know. And, we always hear about cholesterol in terms of lowering our cholesterol. But cholesterol essential. We need it. Our body will actually produce it. So even if someone does not eat any foods with cholesterol, so most of our foods that contain cholesterol are animal product foods. If someone is vegan, doesn't eat any of those, their body will still make cholesterol because it is essential. We need it. And it plays a role in our hormones, cell membrane function, etc. But we can see individuals getting cholesterol ratios that are off, and that does, in a lot of cases, we think potentially affect some of our health risks. So, cholesterol, again, is important, but we'll look a little bit more about ratio of types of cholesterol. And then lastly, when we're looking at types of fatty acids, is our phospholipid. So I want you to think a second and see if have you guys ever seen that cell membrane before? You can kind of see the cell. Does that take you back to any biology class in high school or anything like that? If you don't remember it, it's okay. For a lot of people, it may have been a while and you purposely pushed that out of your head. But these phospholipids form what we call this phospholipid bilayer. And what that does is it has a part that is kind of water hating and a part that's water loving. And so it allows for selective passage of what gets into the cell. And so they're really important with that. The head group tends to be water soluble, and the tails, the fatty acid tails, are going to be insoluble to water. So again, it creates that great environment where it can kind of control what passes through and out. We use these phospholipids as emulsifiers in the culinary perspective. So lecithin is an example. We also see egg yolks that have lecithin in their liver, some plants, things like that, that may be used to emulsify and keep foods together. Egg yolks is probably one of the most common ones. Mustard has an emulsifying effect, etc. And what that does is an emulsifier allows water and a fat to mix. If you've never done this experiment, I will encourage you to do it. We're not in class in person, so we can't do it. But it's very simple. So if you want to see this in action, get a small clear glass that you can see through and add a little bit of oil and add a little bit of water, maybe, half and half, etc. Not half and half in terms of the cream, like half water, half oil, and try to mix it and see what happens. It probably separates really quickly. And if you want an example of an emulsifier with that, you can actually add some dish detergent, some just even Dawn dish soap or anything like that. Doesn't have to be that brand. You can add a few drops of that in and then mix it up, and you'll start to see that dish soap allows the small droplets of fat to be mixed in with the water. So if you've never done that, try it. And it kind of gives you an example of what an emulsifier does and how that can be important in a culinary perspective. And so that's where we're getting, again, phospholipids. That's what it is, and it does play a really crucial role, not just in keeping our salad dressings together, but in maintaining our cell membranes, which is a very important role in our body. So those are our major types of our lipids. Excuse me. We're going to talk quickly about lipid digestion. It is slightly different in that lipids are not water soluble, and our body is very water based, and so we have to have a few things that make lipids easier to be absorbed. And so again, we have our lipases that start fat digestion, mostly in the small intestine. That's not really any different than our other macronutrients. But we do have bile acids. If you remember back to digestion, bile is produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder and then released from the gallbladder into the small intestine. And that bile can act as that emulsifier, allowing those lipids to mix with water. We then can form these micelles that allow those lipids to be absorbed. So again, I don't expect you to be experts on lipid digestion, but just know, if you were to be tested off of that bile is what's required to digest fat because they are not water soluble, and so it is important to have that emulsification process to allow those lipids to be absorbed. The other thing to think about is that we absorb the lipids into the lymphatic system instead of directly into the bloodstream like our water-soluble nutrients. So our lipids and our fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed in this way that you can see on here. So it gives you some visuals of bile kind of forming, those little suspensions with the fat. You can see it breaks it down. I don't expect you to be a expert, but it will break it down like a triglyceride, for example, into the free fatty acids and then monoglycerides. They will then form these micelles, which then can be absorbed into the lymphatic system. So again, very important that we have bile available to help digest fats. So what are our lipoproteins? So these are particles that are formed from proteins and phospholipids to transport lipids in the lymphatic system and blood. And so you've probably heard of some of these lipoproteins, even though if you don't really realize you've heard of those terms. So our LDL and HDL, when we talk about types of cholesterol, those are types of those lipoproteins. So chylomicron is a very large one that's really transporting the lipids away from the small intestine in the lymph system and eventually to the blood. And chylomicrons are actually pictured on the page that we just looked at. Then we have a VLDL, this one maybe one you've never heard about. It's a very low density, and that is responsible for transporting triglycerides to adipose tissue and skeletal muscles. So it's mainly with the triglycerides. Then our LDL, and LDL is often what they'll call bad cholesterol. Again, we need some of that, but this is the one that they're worried about getting. If it is too high, could that be a sign of something else going on? So the LDL is primarily responsible for transporting cholesterol from the liver to the tissues. Whereas the HDL, the high-density lipoprotein, is the opposite of that. It's responsible for transporting the cholesterol from the tissues back to the liver. So the HDL is the one that we want to be higher. That we do consider higher HDL to be cardioprotective, meaning someone who has a higher HDL is less likely, has a lower risk of having a heart attack or heart disease. So this shows you in visual, and it's showing you how much bigger the chylomicrons are, and then they get much smaller as they go down. But this just gives a little bit visual of what we just talked about. So if you want to look at that a little bit more, if you're a visual learner, here it is for you. One next topic that we're going to look at with fats is essential fatty acids. And you also may have heard, especially of omega-3 fatty acids. But these omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are both considered essential fatty acids because our body cannot make them. What omega-3 is again, and this is just kind of semantics for why it's called omega-3, but it has its first double bond at the third carbon from the methyl end of the chain. Again, I'm not worried that you know that, but that's, if you really like those technical details, that's why it is called omega-3. That helps decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. It's thought to increase brain function. We're learning more and more about the role of omega-3. There's a lot of research going on about omega-3s in pregnancy or in infants and what role that has on brain development long term, etc. And it's fascinating to kind of see what that's going to look at. But we do know that we see some benefits from having some of these omega-3s. This is linolenic. Again, I don't necessarily care that you memorize. If you look down to omega-6, you'll see that it's linoleic. So it's linolenic versus linoleic. Those are very confusing to kind of keep apart. If you know omega-3 and omega-6, that's fine. But linolenic is that 18-carbon omega-3 that then is used to produce the EPA and DHA, which is, you can see down there. And you may hear about those. Sometimes I feel like if you're watching commercials and there's a commercial for baby formula, sometimes it talks about EPA and DHA and things like that on there because they are important fatty acids. They aren't efficiently made from that linolenic though, so a great way to increase those EPA and DHA, which tend to have anti-inflammatory effects in our body, is eating more of that fatty fish. That's one good source that we can see those. Omega-6 then is also essential. It's considered an essential fatty acid. We'll look at this, but most Americans maybe get a little bit more omega-6 and not enough omega-3, and so that may cause some health problems. But omega-6 is still considered essential. It's needed for normal growth. We get arachidonic acid from this, so it is really important, but it does tend to be a little bit more inflammatory. So hopefully this gives you some role a little bit of what they do. So they produce hormone-like eicosanoids, which can help regulate blood pressure, inflammation, pain, etc. The eicosanoids made from our omega-6 or our arachidonic acid, those actually increase inflammation and blood clotting. and from omega, the ones made from omega-3 decrease inflammation and blood clotting. And now we hear about inflammation a lot, all the time. About, at least in the last few years, you'll start to hear about inflammation. I feel like anyone, if they're trying to convince you why you should eat a certain food or not eat a certain food, they claim they're all anti-inflammatory, even if they're not. So it makes me laugh. But we do need some of that inflammation, and if you think about it. So let's say, blood clotting is a perfect example. If my blood is not clotting enough, so I don't have, enough omega-6 to increase blood clotting, right? Or there are several other reasons why my blood may not be clotting. And that's going to be a problem, right? You cut yourself, your blood's not clotting enough. You're likely to have a very bad bleed from a small cut, right? But if your blood is clotting too much, on the other hand, that's also a problem. So really we want these things to be in this happy medium. Again, remember I talked about Goldilocks? I think it's kind of the same for most things in our body. We have this happy medium where too little or too much is problematic. And so that's why, it is important to have some of that, omega-6 still. Inflammation is also something that can be really important in terms of growth and healing. Again, we don't necessarily want our body to be in a constant state of inflammation. We know that can be dangerous and cause a lot of health problems, but we do need some of that inflammation in certain times to properly grow or heal. So it's a balance. It's all about keeping things in line. And so that's where with that omega-3 and omega-6 balance is important. And so remember I said the ratio, a lot of Americans consume a much higher ratio. They have way more omega-6 than they need and not enough omega-3. And so it's really about getting those closer together to where you have a better balance of that ratio. Hopefully that helps. If that confused you, feel free to shoot me an email if you have more questions. I know some people are really interested in this or interested in inflammation and want to ask some questions, so feel free to shoot those over to me as well. So this gives you some information about the sources of essential fatty acids, and this really just breaks down for us a similar chart to what we saw back when we were looking at saturated and monounsaturated, but this one just breaks down polyunsaturated into 6 or 3. So you can see flaxseed oil and a lot of our fatty fishes are actually really, fatty fish are going to be really good sources of omega-3s. Walnuts are also a good source of omega-3, but they also do have a lot of omega-6 if you look at that on there. Canola oil actually has a fairly good ratio of 3 to 6 compared to really any of our other vegetable oils. I mean, you go down to olive oil, which I think is great as well, but it has about a 1 to 10 ratio of 3 to 6. It does have a lot more monounsaturated, which we also know are very beneficial. But some of these other ones have better ratios of 3 to 6. Now, again, there's a lot of other things to look at with oils in terms of how they're processed, etc. But there's a lot of misinformation out there about which oil is best. There's some scare tactics about oils, etc. So you can look through those a little bit and see, the differences on some of those. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about trans fats. I talked about the process before, about how often it was made to make liquid vegetable oils a little bit more solid, and we thought this was a good idea. And I say we, it was a long time ago, but it was kind of a decision that was said, we know we need less saturated fats in our diet, so what if we took some more of these vegetable oils and made them a little bit more solid? But then they realized that those actually have a very similar effect to saturated fats in the body. And so now we've really tried to avoid these. In the last several years, you've started to see them banned from certain jurisdictions. I think, and I don't know for sure they were first, but I know New York City was one of the first to ban trans fats, and I'm not sure if it was in every place that was sold, or sometimes they'll do those initiations where it's just, they'll start with restaurants that have 10 or more locations or something in the city. But they've really started to say you can't have trans fats in foods that are stored. So you're starting to see less and less trans fats in our food supply, but you can still see it. So what do you look for? So hydrogenation is that process. That's a chemical process where these things are made into unsaturated or trans unsaturated fatty acids. Just so you know, there are some naturally occurring trans fats, but those aren't the ones we're really concerned about. We're concerned about the ones that are added in there. Partial hydrogenation then is really converting some of the unsaturated fatty acids from cis to trans, and you'll see this a lot. Partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, if you see that as an ingredient in a food label, which is common. I mean, go to the grocery store and look at your snack cakes and you'll probably find some. That's going to be a common way you can see on there. Baked goods, packaged snacks, you know, margarine. It says popcorn, but really with popcorn. I know several of you said that you like popcorn snacks, which is great. I do too. This is really more what is on the popcorn. So it's naturally not in popcorn, but what do we add onto it can be a big source of trans fats. So again, we want to try to limit those foods that have the partially hydrogenated oils on there. So what about fat substitutes? We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we do see some of these. It's less common now than it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. I remember seeing those Olestra potato chips. So they had those Olestra, I don't know, like Lay's or something. And so it was a fat substitute, and so it was a similar configuration, but they weren't absorbed in the body. So if you think about, I mean, in theory, you're like, oh, great, I could eat as much of this as I want. I don't absorb the calories. Great. But that really is not what happens, because if we eat something, if you think about our digestive tract that we just used, and it's not being absorbed, it has to go out somewhere. And so there are often negative GI effects on some of these. So you have to be careful. This and Ally is another example. If you remember the Ally, I think you can still buy that. There are some pills that you could take to cause fat malabsorption as well. And some of those things had warning labels to like, don't try for the first time when you're out in public. So if that gives you any indication of what might happen. So again, I don't see these used often. The side effects aren't very good, but some people did use these. So if you've seen them, that's what they are. So what are the recommendations for fat intake? So it isn't zero. It isn't consume as little fat as possible. Like that was kind of the thing of the 90s. Some of you probably don't remember that at all. Some of you hopefully will remember what that was like, where everything was fat-free. Well, not everything, but you had a lot of fat-free products out there on the market. So it's really just having a balance, getting good fats, because we do need fats. It's about 20 to 35%. So almost about a third of your calories can come from fat in a healthy diet. Now, again, there's a lot of things which we'll talk about down the road in this semester about like the ketogenic diet or consuming higher levels of fat. And there may be some place for that in certain cases, but these are just general recommendations for the overall population. So again, focus on unsaturated fats, increase omega-3 fatty acids. Those tend to be the biggest recommendations as well. One thing I'll point out, because I don't know how much we talked about this, I don't think I mentioned it very much in the first two chapters, but they are taking away the dietary recommendations around cholesterol and sticking with the saturated fat. Now, people are like, what? And the reason they're doing that is because we're finding that dietary cholesterol, so there's a lot of foods that have a lot of dietary cholesterol also have a lot of saturated fat. Some are a little bit kind of outsiders, like shrimp and eggs, that maybe have a decent amount of cholesterol, but they actually are fairly low in the saturated fat area. And we found that those foods that have a lot of cholesterol really doesn't have an effect on the overall cholesterol levels in your body as much as the amount of saturated fat that someone's taking in has an effect on the cholesterol levels in their body. And again, the type of saturated fat can even make a difference. So it is very complicated when you look at that. But it's something that they're kind of saying, you don't necessarily need to worry about looking at cholesterol as much, but you can look at the saturated fat in the foods. Again, there's a lot of debate about coconut oil and those kind of things. And I will put up a coconut oil article for you to read on there. And you guys can kind of see what your opinion is on that. But there's not a lot of evidence to support some of the claims that are being made about the health benefits of coconut oil. Again, that doesn't mean you can't ever have it, and that it may be great for certain things. some of the claims about the smoke point are also maybe a little bit blown out of proportion. Depending on how refined the coconut oil is, it may really not have that much of a difference in smoke point. So it's going to depend on that. So there's a lot of things to think about. I also saw a whole nother set of research articles in the last couple of weeks about how there may be some compounds in certain oils that may protect against some of that oxidation, and so we really may not be able to just use smoke point as a real gauge of how much oxidation is happening when we're cooking with fatty acids. So something to look at. It'll be interesting to move forward with that. So again, I don't really like some of these terms like harmful. I tend to shy away from making foods feel like they're good or bad, right? Foods have no moral value inherently, but this is just showing you maybe foods we should limit. So our trans fats, hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, so you can see some of those foods there that tend not to be, the best. That doesn't mean never consume them, but those tend to be a little bit of things we should probably limit. Moving to our saturated fats there, so red meat, butter, ice cream, cheese. Moving to monounsaturated, plant omega-6, plant omega-3, and seafood omega-3 as well. I think there's some people who would argue that you should move monounsaturated a little bit higher up there in place of some of those others as well, but it is really important to get a good mix of healthy fats. So again, more green than red. That doesn't mean you can't have a healthy diet and still have some of those more saturated fat foods. One thing to look at, I want you to look at this in your book. Remember I said you could have questions about these on the tests that come up. But there is that heart study that they talk about in the book, and this was conducted in Louisiana. And their goal is to follow children and help determine what causes heart disease. And they go into a little bit more detail in your book, but essentially they were able to follow some of these children and collect information about them, their diet, their lifestyle, other things like that as they grew up. And then there were actually some parents who were very gracious if a child or a young adult ended up passing away, especially from anything maybe not related at all to heart. The family, in a lot of those cases, would donate their bodies to, in this study, and this individual who was able to do some research and actually gain a lot of insight on, kind of how plaque developed even in early adolescence or early adulthood, and really see how that was tied to lifestyle effects. So, gave us a little bit of insight that we can see some of these things happening pretty early in life. A lot of times people don't tend to think about heart disease until later, but there may have already been effects that have happened earlier in life that are hard to reverse. So that was kind of an interesting point from the study, but there's more there if you would like to read that. Why do we care when we're talking about cardiovascular disease in general? So if you remember back when we looked at some of the other chapters earlier, when we talked about causes of death, we talked about cardiovascular disease being the leading cause of death in the U.S. Just some stats to look at. About a third of adults in the U.S. have high blood pressure. They estimate about 29% of all deaths in the U.S. are caused by cardiovascular disease. And about 35% of adults in the U.S. have cardiovascular disease. And about 14% of adults in the U.S. have high blood cholesterol. So obviously factors that will have a big impact on our healthcare system. So one thing we talk about when we talk about heart disease is atherosclerosis, and that's a type of cardiovascular disease characterized by the narrowing of the blood vessels. They lose some elasticity as well, but you can start to see some plaque build up and inflammation on there as well. So this gives you some idea of how a clot would form. So early plaque, you can see some plaque accumulating, and there are several things that can affect that. We can see high LDL. They can become oxidized, they can cause inflammation, injury to the vessel. There's also a lot of thought that having high blood sugar or other inflammatory states in the body causes more injury to that blood vessel, allowing more plaque to develop as well. You can start to see the advanced plaque, and then plaque, you may see some plaque rupture, which can promote the formation of a blood clot. When we have blood clots, that can really occlude the blood going through that artery and cause a lot of concerns. This increases the risk for two things, so a heart attack or myocardial infarction, and that's damage to the heart tissue. And that's really when you have decreased blood flow to the heart. So you'll have a clot in somewhere that's affecting the heart. And then stroke, and that is an event that occurs when blood vessels that supply the brain are either blocked or damaged. So again, all of these things are things that we're concerned about, and atherosclerosis can increase the risk of both of those things happening. So again, this gives you some image of the heart attack and stroke if you're more visual and want to look at that, if that's helpful. So what are some risk factors? So we have risk factors that can't be modified. We can't change our family history of heart disease, our race, our age, our gender. Some things just, are going to affect our disease risk or cardiovascular disease more than others. We can modify some risk factors, so we do call these modifiable risk factors, and these are things like smoking, a diet high in saturated and trans fats, cholesterol, sodium, and added sugar increase our risk for cardiovascular disease, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, diabetes, excessive alcohol consumption, having high blood pressure and high lipid levels can also increase our risk. Those are maybe less modifiable in some ways. It's less in your control than, let's say, walking is more in your control. But those are still things we consider modifiable risk factors. So this is going to give you a little bit more information on that. But you can see the poor diets, physical inactivity. I think this may be the first time your book's mentioned, but they recommend 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise per week. You can see some other things on here that will also affect that. We talked about the lipoproteins, and I wanted to bring those up again to talk about the type and amount in our blood increase our risk for heart disease. And those who have high total blood cholesterol are 2 times as likely to have heart disease. And that higher HDL, remember that good cholesterol, we consider that, actually decrease our risk for heart disease. So this shows you, if you've ever wondered what the numbers are for cholesterol, you can see total cholesterol ideally is under 200. Anything under 200 is desirable. For HDL, you actually want it to be above 60. Again, above that 60 is going to be considered cardioprotective. That's the only one where the green's on the top of the arrow, because that's when you want it to be higher. With our LDL cholesterol, you want that to be under 100. A lot of times you'll see under 130, though. That's near optimal on that. And then for triglycerides, and that's just total triglycerides in the blood, we want that to be under 150 is considered normal. So again, this just gives you some insight to kind of, if you ever had your cholesterol done, to see, hey, where am I at? Where does that fit? One other thing to look at is called metabolic syndrome, and metabolic syndrome occurs when someone has at least 3 of those following things. So excessive abdominal fat, which can be measured through a couple ways. We can do it through waist circumference, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL, or high blood sugar. And if someone has at least 3 of those, then we consider them to be much higher risk for developing some cardiovascular disease or stroke in the near future. This affects about 25% of adults worldwide. And why they classify these is, if you think about it, especially with, let's look at low HDL. Some people genetically have low HDL, but maybe that's the only thing that they have that's a risk factor for this. They're overall fairly healthy. They have normal blood pressure. Everything else on this list checks out in the normal range. So they're obviously going to be at a much lower risk of having an event than someone who comes in and checks 4 out of the 5 of these boxes. And so the point of making metabolic syndrome out there and something that they're looking at is to try to really figure out how to effectively manage someone with some of these conditions, because, obviously when it comes to medications and things like that, you really want to pair, all medications have risk, and so we want to make sure we're giving them people who would benefit the most for them, and maybe people who are, even though maybe their cholesterol is a little bit off, they have overall fairly low risk, maybe medication isn't right for them. And so there's lots of reasons why we'd have this metabolic syndrome diagnosis, but having this can really give some insight into how that individual needs to be handling their health concerns. So when we talk about an overall heart protective diet, what does that look like? And I'm going to explain this study to you, I think this is very fascinating because there's a lot of debate about this right now. I mean, you're seeing a lot of talk about, like I mentioned, the ketogenic diet, other things like that. And, you know, it is important to have fat. I absolutely believe that. And we may see more come out in the next few years about this, but this study, what they did is looked at what you replace fat with in your diet. And so what you're looking at here is the ones in the green, the scenarios, what that scenario is saying, decreased risk, and the bigger the bar, the more decreased risk you have. And so if you took the first one saying if you had 5% of your, if you took 5% of your calories from saturated fat and replaced those with carbohydrates, so you cut out, and that again is what a lot of the foods did when you made low fat or fat free foods. They added sugar and took away some of the fat. Well, that in this case, this does still decrease risk slightly, but it's much less, and even that one's the only one that maybe slightly increased risk as well. If you go down, you see increasing or replacing 5% of energy from saturated fat with monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acids. And in both of those cases, you actually saw an even larger decreased risk in heart disease. And so again, they're saying, you know, in this case, it doesn't make sense. We're not saying to take away, eat less saturated fat and eat more carbs instead, but keep our fat between that, you know, 20 to 35%, but take less saturated fat in and consume more monounsaturated and more polyunsaturated. So not less fat, but just change the types of fats. This was even bigger if we looked at replacing even 2% of energy from trans fats from either kind of unsaturated fatty acids. We saw an even bigger jump in decreased risk. Now on the other side, if we replaced our monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats with carbohydrates, again, what a lot of times is happening in those non-fat days where, you know, sometimes they took good fats and replaced those in foods. You know, instead of our salad dressing with olive oil, we had, you know, more sugar in the dressing to make it taste better, but there was really no oil. And in those cases, if you're replacing our mono or polyunsaturated fats with carbs, we saw a increased risk of heart disease. So I think this is a fascinating way to break down and say, yes, we need fat. It's important to think about the types of fats we're consuming. And it's all about overall diet pattern, which matters. So again, if you're ever really interested in some of these, you can go look up some of these studies. And if you're on the Johnson County Library website, even if you're at home, you should be able to pull up a lot of these for free if you're interested in looking at them more. So the National Cholesterol Education Program has come out with a therapeutic lifestyle changes program. And really what that is it's just some ideas for potentially doing a heart protective diet. So low in saturated fat, enough plant sterol, so really eating enough healthy plant fats, healthy fiber, looking at weight management and getting physical activity in. And physical activity, I know we haven't talked about too much, but in this case they're talking, you know, walking. It doesn't have to be anything very strenuous to still see benefits. Okay, so this is an interesting slide as well, and it looks like the atherosclerosis we talked about, but if you read the little blurb off to the side, it's showing you that this is actually with Alzheimer's disease. So these are actually blood arteries that feed the brain, and so this is showing you a healthy artery compared to those arteries narrowed by plaque, and so it's showing you individuals with Alzheimer's are more likely to have that narrowed plaque artery. So it's interesting to look at Alzheimer's in that similar way, that it's kind of a progressive condition in some ways. Now we know there's genetic links. We know there's a lot of complicated reasons why someone may get Alzheimer's and someone may not. But we are seeing some of these intracranial atherosclerosis as that contributing factor. So it's something that we're looking at and we have to think about in terms of diet and prevention of Alzheimer's disease as well. So what are some strategies to reduce the risk of heart disease? So some things we just talked about, more plant-based sterols, more plant-based diets. We'll talk about that in the protein chapter as well. Nut consumption, so healthy fats really from nuts, oily Cold water fish such as tuna and salmon, whole grain oats, moderate alcohol consumption, having more unsaturated fats compared to saturated fats, but all of those things are in that strategies to lower the risk of heart disease. So this gives you some visuals on that if that's helpful as well. And lastly, we're going to talk really briefly about some fat intake and heart health beyond heart disease. And so we did just talk about with Alzheimer's disease, which is interesting as well. But other things, a high-fat diet, a high animal fat diet in particular is thought to increase the risk for cancer. Again, you're seeing a lot more research on that these days with the trend of some high-fat diets. And so you may see that change, but where the research at right now tends to lean in this case. Then we do see plant foods are protective. So doing more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fish, those tend to be protective against a lot of diseases in our body. So a lot of times we look at our overall good things to do for a healthy heart tend to be the good things to do for a healthy brain, for healthy kidneys, for healthy skin, all of that. So really it's hard to look at diet in terms of just one factor because it's all interrelated. So in the next chapter we will look at protein and talk about some of these concepts a little bit more. Thank you.